Is the United Nations fit for purpose? President Volodymyr Zelenskyy calls out the UN for failure to act in Ukraine. So is it time for reform or a new model entirely? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the United Nations. After the chaos and devastation of World War II, the world came to realize that an effective body for international governance was needed. So, in 1945, 51 countries came together to form the United Nations. Its aim was to promote peace, security, and foster friendly relations on the global stage. According to the UN Charter, the goal was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. But with the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine leaving thousands dead and millions displaced, the role of the UN is once again under scrutiny. On Tuesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy spoke via video link to the UN and took aim at the 15-member Security Council.
So, where is the security that Security Council needs to guarantee? It is not there. Although there is a Security Council, where is that peace? Where are those guarantees that the United Nations needs to guarantee? It is obvious that the key institution of the world, which must ensure the coercion of any aggression to peace, simply cannot work effectively.
So why do so many believe the UN is powerless or ineffective? It's unfair to say it's achieved nothing in its more than 75-year history. Among its list of successes, it's provided millions of people with life-saving humanitarian aid. It's protected over 1,000 World Heritage sites and saved millions from life-threatening diseases, including smallpox. But when it comes to preventing war, the UN has a more questionable record. As of now, many, even those inside the body, including Secretary General Antonio Guterres, have criticized the UN's ability to prevent conflict, including, of course, in Ukraine.
I deeply regret the divisions that have prevented the Security Council from acting not only on Ukraine, but on other threats to peace and security around the world. I urge the Council to do everything in its power to end the war and to mitigate its impact, both on the suffering people of Ukraine and on vulnerable people in developing countries around the world.
There are several other scars on the UN's war prevention record. Here's a look at some of the most prominent ones. The UN failed to stop the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. Though a majority of member states considered the war illegal, the US, backed by the UK, launched a war without UN support. In Bosnia, UN peacekeepers failed to stop the massacre of 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica. And in 1994, Rwanda witnessed one of the worst ethnic genocides in history after 800,000 people were slaughtered by Hutu extremists. 2 decades later, then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon spoke of the shame in failing to prevent that massacre.
Many United Nations personnel and others showed remarkable bravery, but we could have done much more. We should have done much more.
So, as the conflict in Ukraine continues, is the UN proving its worth or worthlessness? Joining me now to discuss that and more is Iuliia Osmolovska, a former Ukrainian diplomat and chairperson of the Transatlantic Dialogue Center. Zachary Paikin joins us from Brussels. He's a senior visiting fellow at the Global Policy Institute and a researcher in EU foreign policy at the Center for European Policy Studies. And from London is Rosa Freedman, a United Nations researcher and law professor at Reading University. Thanks all so much for being with us. Iuliia, let me start with you. You know, I listed some of the cases where the UN really failed to prevent the true horrors of conflict in the past, when in hindsight it really should have been possible. Do you think the UN is now destined to see the same mistakes or failures in Ukraine?
Well, definitely, we all in Ukraine are sure that United Nations just proved that they have limited capacity of influence conflicts in the world, and Ukraine's case is just the testing ground. And actually, the parallels that we made here is going back to the failure of the League of Nations on the eve of Second World War, when Soviet Union was excluded from it because of the war with Finland. But actually, it led at the end still to the League of Nations being completely dissolved because they were in no capacity to influence the events. And what we see right now, and what actually we've heard about these discussions on Security Council recently about the recent atrocities in Bucha, so just proves this assumption from our side.
Okay, Zachary, some say it's actually an impossible task for the UN to prevent conflicts in the way we would hope it could, because there are so many interests involved and, 51 organizations that founded it. It's now, dozens more. And the Security Council, of course, has its numerous challenges. I mean, are we expecting this organization to run in a way that is technically impossible, or could it do much better?
Well, I'm sure there's always room for improvement, but I think that it's useful to recall the former UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld's very famous quote, which is that the United Nations were not created to take the world to heaven. They were created to prevent the world from falling into hell. And indeed, despite the horrific atrocities that we have witnessed take place in Ukraine since the start of this conflict, the United Nations nonetheless has not seen happen on its watch a world war directly between great powers. And that's ultimately why the League of Nations collapsed. It's because it collapsed in the middle of a Second World War. And it just goes to show that expelling great powers from international bodies doesn't necessarily, prevent war from taking place. So the number one responsibility of the United Nations is to uphold international peace and security. And one way to do that, of course, is to try to prevent these regional conflicts like the one in Ukraine we're seeing right now from emerging. It is not always successful in doing that, although sometimes it has been. But international peace and security are, number one, benefited most of all when great power war is avoided. And that's precisely why the 5 major powers have a veto at the UN Security Council.
Okay. But, I mean, you talk about an aim to prevent regional conflicts, though. But now we're hearing mention, as you know, of potentially a third world war. Will the UN be able to stop that as per its original purpose?
If the United Nations respects its founding structures effectively, which means that you cannot use force without the United Nations Security Council officially approving it, or unless it's a case of self-defense. Those are the only 2 cases under the UN Charter that you are allowed to use force in the name of self-defense and in the name of collective security as approved by the UN Security Council. Then there will not be a great power war. And this is reinforced by the logic of mutual assured destruction. Now, obviously, there are still major risks of this conflict escalating to the level of a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, in which case the United Nations' existence would very much be called into doubt.
Okay. I mean, Rosa, what is possible to actually change at the UN to make it more effective? I mean, why not just allow, for example, a majority vote in the General Assembly rather than at the Security Council, or a majority vote within the Security Council itself?
It's an interesting question, and I will answer it, but I'd like to challenge my colleague first and foremost, which is that there are mechanisms within the United Nations for either expelling a member state that commits acts of aggression, but also for intervening where there is a genocide being perpetrated, which arguably there is currently in Ukraine. And we can't just look at international peace and security as preventing a third world war. We also have to look at international peace and security as preventing states from undermining the entire purpose of the UN and the founding principle that states are sovereign entities, not entities that can be walked into by their neighbours if they want to take them over. But coming back to your point about the UN and how it could be reformed, of course, there are ways in which Russia can be dealt with by the United Nations. We're seeing today that the UN General Assembly has called a vote on a resolution to expel Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, which also has happened in terms of Libya when it was committing grave atrocities under Gaddafi's regime. There are ways diplomatically of saying that Yes, Russia is standing unopposed for election to other UN bodies and that other states ought to challenge it. But really what we're talking about is the need to reform the UN Security Council. And that is an issue that has been talked about for many years, reforming these 5 great powers who hold a veto power at the Security Council. It's very difficult to do. And maybe this is going to be the catalyst for having some form of change to the UN itself, to change the structure of the Security Council and who holds power in these situations.
Right, but how do you get to that if the Security Council still, according to the rules of the UN, has this veto? The 5 permanent members have this veto power, so Russia would effectively have to vote to eject itself, would it not?
I mean, there are ways under the UN Charter that the state that's the aggressor state doesn't actually get a vote in the Security Council when discussing those acts of aggression. There's ways of reopening the UN Charter, which needs 2/3 of the membership to do so. But let's be clear, international law is important, but what really matters is international relations and state power. If the vast majority of states in the UN want to change the structure, they will do. They will find ways to do it diplomatically. And this sort of extraordinary focus on the law undermines the agency of the 193 member states who actually run the organization.
Very interesting. Okay, Zachary, I have to come back to you because...
If I could jump in there.
Yeah, I would like you to, because I did see you disagreeing, I mean, rather agreeing with Rosa, disagreeing with you. So go ahead.
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, my understanding, at least, is that it's possible indeed to expel a country from the UN General Assembly on a recommendation from the UN Security Council, but not to expel a country from the UN Security Council altogether, as some people have begun to call for. Especially since, and of course there will not be a recommendation from the UN Security Council to eject Russia from the General Assembly because Russia is a veto-wielding member of the Security Council. But even, given the point that was just made concerning, the importance of, respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, I 100% agree with that, and that is absolutely a founding principle of the United Nations Charter and indeed of the current international order in which we live. But let's remember that despite the fact that 141 different countries voted in favor of condemning Russia at the UN General Assembly, 1/4 of countries did not. That's a lot, right? I mean, the crime of aggression is indeed the worst crime that you can technically commit in the context of today's international order, and yet 1/4 of countries in the world, including some pretty big ones like India and China, Vietnam, many others, that voted for the resolution but did so grudgingly. This really shows the extent to which so many countries in the world, representing a majority of the world's population, I might add, really view the war in Ukraine as a dispute between Russia and the West. And we might not like that, but part of that has to do with the fact that we in the West have not been speaking sufficiently to the concerns of the rest of the world for some time. And that's something that we absolutely want to change if indeed we want to reform the United Nations in a fashion that helps us to preserve the rules-based character of the international order.
Okay, let me come back to Iuliia, because Iuliia, you are a diplomat yourself. Speak to us, if you can, about the institution of diplomacy and whether it, as an institution itself, I mean, maybe in the context of the United Nations, could also improve in its own mechanisms to prevent conflict.
Well, I'd like to start with the point that the colleagues made about whether this exclusion of Russia from United Nations as such would prevent the further escalation. And my answer would be also no. And this is the major point. And if we talk about of other countries getting into this conflict and seeing it potentially evolving into a third world war, so actually in the current times, given the hybrid nature of wars, a lot of countries are already actually engaged in this third world war, because if you're talking about the sanctions or the means of supplying Ukraine with weapons, or the countries that are supporting Russia in here, so plenty of countries are already involved in that. And definitely, I don't think as a diplomat that any sort of diplomatic means available at the moment could stop this war. So our assumption is that Russia is not ready for meaningful negotiations so far. And what we need to do is to get through the second stage to the position when Russia will understand that they are losing completely and would be agreeing to have some sort of meaningful dialogue. That is not the case at the moment, unfortunately.
Okay, Zachary, you seem to shake your head when Iuliia was saying there are no diplomatic means available at present to resolve this conflict. Did you disagree?
Well, I am quite pessimistic at the current state of affairs, but that wasn't what I was shaking my head at. I was shaking my head at the notion that providing military assistance to Ukraine somehow makes the West a belligerent in this conflict. Under international law, that does not make Western countries a belligerent in the conflict. For example, if India were to attack Pakistan tomorrow with Russian-made weapons, and India purchases a lot of Russian-made weapons, that doesn't mean that Russia becomes a party to the war between India and Pakistan. So I think we have to be very careful about that. There have been many voices in Ukraine and certain more hawkish voices in the West itself that have been arguing since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine that we should enforce, for example, a no-fly zone over Ukrainian skies because we're already in World War III, we're already a party to the war. No, that is absolutely wrong. We do not want to see World War III happen, and if World War III happens, we will not be here to talk about it. So we need to get a little sense of perspective here and to understand that the purpose of statecraft, whether it's in relations between states or indeed at the United Nations, needs to be, of course, to bring this conflict to a just resolution to the extent that that's possible, but also to avoid World War III, to avoid a direct escalation between NATO and Russia.
Okay. Rosa, perhaps you could also comment on the concept that states can be complicit, arguably, in certain conflicts when they provide the tools to perpetuate that conflict, because that is in question right now.
I mean, it's a very interesting one, this idea that NATO can't intervene currently, but could intervene in terms of the war in the former Yugoslavia. That NATO is saying right now that it can't intervene because it hasn't triggered Article 5 and that it's not impacted on another NATO country, but isn't looking at the collective self-defense part of the United Nations, which would allow NATO to intervene, and yet is trying to do this backdoor route of providing lots of weapons and everything else to help and to support Ukraine. And we know that NATO countries have been training Ukrainian troops since 2014, since this war started, because the war didn't just start 6 weeks ago. But I want to go back to something Zachary said, which is that we need to keep things in perspective. There's a genocide being perpetrated. We need to keep that in perspective. I understand his point about not wanting to escalate to World War III and not wanting to have nuclear weapons be used. I grew up in the 1980s where there was a threat of nuclear weapons being used all the time. But a sense of perspective does not allow us to close our eyes to the fact that a genocide is being perpetrated, that the most horrific human rights abuses are being documented on rolling news 24/7 in front of our eyes. We can't say because of the fear of a war that we do not have a responsibility to intervene. And in fact, the United Nations has this. It's a political duty, the responsibility to protect. The United Nations isn't just formed on, and I'm going to disagree with one of the premises he said, it's not just formed on peace and security being the foremost, the priority. It's formed on 3 pillars: human rights, development, and peace and security. And we are seeing the gravest human rights abuses in Europe since Nazi Germany being perpetrated in front of our eyes.
Go ahead, Zachary.
I'm not here to say, sure, thank you. I'm certainly not saying that, first of all, that a responsibility to protect is synonymous with military intervention, because it's not, and you and I both know that. But if we are talking about military intervention, a military intervention under the context of the R2P doctrine can only take place with the approval of the UN Security Council. I mean, the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia, which was just referenced, that was illegal. That was illegal. There is no doubt about that. And it has been concluded that it might have been moral, it might have been legitimate, but it was illegal. And right now if we're talking about a military intervention, and that means a direct military intervention, not just providing military assistance to Ukraine, but a direct military intervention to enforce, for example, a no-fly zone would mean attacking Russian forces, not only Russian forces that are in Ukraine, but also Russian forces and Russian military equipment that are stationed on Russian sovereign territory that are capable of reaching Ukrainian skies. That would start a war between NATO and Russia. And we absolutely have a commitment to document what's going on right now in the face of these horrific crimes, and of course to find some sort of way to bring about justice. But at the end of the day, mass atrocities are one thing, but a nuclear holocaust is far, far worse. And it's very difficult. We live in a world, unfortunately, where we don't always have a good option. Foreign policy is sometimes about choosing between, a bad option and a worse option, and we have to be extremely careful about that. I mean, we've been talking for the past several years for example, about the potential of a genocide in China's Xinjiang region, right, and whether or not that qualifies as a genocide. And many parliaments around the world have offered that opinion already, that it does constitute a genocide. We have not seen, a direct military intervention in that case either to protect the Uyghur people of Xinjiang, and there's a very good reason for that. So, we can escalate tensions with great powers and end up with a world in which there's almost no trust and there's, a risk of tens of millions of people being incinerated. Or we can try to find some sort of way to build an international order that might be more de minimis than the expectations that we've, shrouded the UN in over the past several decades, but might nonetheless stand the chance of bringing about more international peace and security, at least on the big ticket issues.
Let me get to Iuliia quickly, because it must be disheartening in a way for you to hear this, because you would like to see some sort of intervention, because it's your people that are suffering so terribly.
No, actually,
Go ahead.
Our president was quite clear on that, we are not asking for the Western partners to get involved in this directly by sending their troops. We just want more weapons, and weapons for us to be able to defend the country and just to defeat the enemy. This is one thing, and you should keep this in mind. Second one is about Third World War. I mentioned deliberately that this is, in a current age, it is about hybrid type of war. It means that it's not about just conventional interaction on the ground. And that means that if you take this information realm, if you take this economic realm, so it means that to some extent still the countries are getting involved in this. And you shouldn't forget about the ultimate goal of Putin, which is not limited just to Ukraine. As our Deputy Minister of Defense just said, that the date of 24th of February could happen in any European countries. And if we could just judge the Russians' logos and mottos in recent 8 years, they were saying like going to Berlin. So we can repeat what we've done in the Second World War. So it means that it's not about just winning over Ukraine, but to get the influence and restore the division in Europe as it existed after the Second World War. So because keeping of this in mind, keeping the strategic goal of Russia, you should all be aware that you can't just limit yourself of sitting in comfort countries and just waiting for the conflict somehow dissolved on Ukrainian soil. So I mean that there is a high risk that a lot of countries are really getting dragged into it in this way or another, and you can just simply miss this moment when the Third World War could be just outbroken.
Okay. I mean, by intervention, I didn't necessarily mean military intervention. There could be a stronger diplomatic intervention that some seem to be, I should say, shying away of. But
if I may just add on diplomatic intervention, yes, to give some glimpse of hope. Currently, there are talks about reconstructing security structure in whole Europe, and our president just said that we'd like to talk about the security guarantees first. And Russia is saying that we need to keep in mind the inseparable security principle in Europe. That means that we're not going to talk about just security framework or security guarantees for Ukraine, but also for all the European countries involved. And right now, these series of negotiations and diplomatic interactions of Ukraine with Western partners are happening before actually next meaningful round with Russia. So I think that there is some room for maneuver for diplomatic efforts here, but we have to see how the situation will evolve later, because Russians are still decisive not to withdraw their troops from Ukrainian territory and keep shelling and bombing and striking over the country.
Okay, we just have a minute left. Rosa, I needed to ask you this quickly. I mean, because we really are talking about the United Nations itself as the institution that it is. And I need to ask you, I mean, how just outdated a concept now are these 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, especially, when we remember that the Soviet Union was replaced by Russia under then-President Boris Yeltsin, while countries like Japan and Germany have been kept out. Why has it not reformed over the course of the decades?
Well, you mentioned it at the very beginning of the program, that the United Nations was created by about a quarter of the countries that exist today. Most countries that exist today were under colonial rule. They were part of empires. They did actually fight as part of the 5 great powers that defeated Nazi Germany, but they didn't fight in their own names. They fought in the names of their colonial rulers. And the veto power that was vested into those five great powers is absolutely outdated. There's a reason that the United Kingdom and that France has not used its veto power for so long, because it knows it doesn't have the power militarily, politically, or economically to back up a veto. What we're seeing currently within the UN is many countries who have started to rely on the soft power that Russia is rolling out. And you mentioned it earlier about China and the Uyghurs, countries that feel indebted to them for building roads, for building banks, for building buildings. The kind of soft power that only the US used to have through Coca-Cola and McDonald's and their version of soft power. And those countries are backing Russia. But I don't know how long they'll back Russia for. And one last thing that will be of interest is that Russia has sent out, in advance of this UN General Assembly vote today, has sent out letters to countries in New York, to their missions, telling them about all the retaliations that will happen if they vote against if they vote against Russia staying on the Human Rights Council. Let's be clear that the diplomatic efforts are not always done in a particularly nice and pleasant way.
Okay. I will have to let that be the last word. So unfortunately, we are out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.